Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. We begin right at 3 to ensure that we don't even lose any seconds of Professor Raja Mohan's time here. As much as possible, we want to maximize his presence. And on behalf of ISAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's seminar on a most provocative and contemporary subject, Decoding India's Reservations on China's Belt and Road Initiative, to be delivered by Professor Raja Mohan. Now, it's of course very useful to say that he does not need any introduction, but nonetheless, for the sake of formality, I'll go through a few lines about Professor Raja Mohan. I'll begin with the fact that he continues to remain a colleague with all of us at ISAS. He is a visiting research professor here, and he is also currently heading the Carnegie India Center at Delhi. And he, of course, has been one of the most prominent experts of contemporary international relations and policy studies from India, whose views are widely sought by both academic and policy circles. And this is a subject on which I suppose Professor Mohan's views would be more than most welcome, because on this, he hasn't written or spoken much, I suspect, except for one or two sporadic columns. And of course, this, I suppose, has just ended in terms of the first formal forum in Beijing. So it will be wonderful to have his views on this. So Raja, without wasting further time, maybe if I could hand over the session to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amitendu. Thank you for that generous introduction and hosting me here. It's a pleasure always to come back to ISAS and to Singapore, where I have spent about 3 years teaching at the NTU, and then as a visiting fellow for 4 years at the Institute of South Asian Studies. So it's a pleasure to come back and meet so many old friends and make some new ones, I hope. When we gave this title, Decoding India's Reservations, I thought, I'll have to kind of deconstruct the Indian position. But I think the government of India has stolen my thunder. I think on Saturday night, those of you who haven't read that statement, I strongly suggest you read that pretty 600-word statement on the Belt and Road Initiative that quite clearly lays out India's position. And it's making quite a lot of circulation on the Twitter and the internet, because no one has presented such a sharp critique of the BRI, to use the Chinese latest phrase of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's on the government website, or you can see it all over the place. But I think, so I was not expecting that. I thought the government was hedging its bets. But in the end, hours before the forum actually took place, they did come out probably with one of the sharpest statements, both laying out their objections and why they are not attending it. But we'll go into that. But I think it's quite clearly India was not there. The party Mr. President Xi Jinping was having, India was probably the only major economy that was not present. Even the US and the Japanese, who were opposed, seemingly had reservations, were present at some level or the other. Most of India's neighbors, of course, were there in attendance for the summit. So a lot of people have criticized the government of India for isolating India, and that maybe they should have gone there, done something. I don't know if I'll agree with that criticism, because the large countries can't be isolated, I believe, and India is actually quite used to, on some issues like the nuclear issue, to be quite isolated. So I don't think isolation is not the problem. The question is whether, because this forum is over, it was only about participating in the forum, but the issues raised by the Belt and Road Initiative are going to be around. So what does it mean for India? I think that is the real issue, and not a question of whether we should have gone there or not gone there. That is really secondary. So my focus of my presentation for the next 20 minutes or so will be less on BRI and more on the problem, what is India's problem with it. And to put this in some kind of at least in a historical context, rather than merely seeing it in the immediate sense of what is happening today. So let me do this in three parts. Of one, looking at the historical and the geographic context in which the BRI has come. Second, to look at India's current approach, that is, at least look at the reservations that it has expressed. And third, look at where does India go from here? What policy options does India have in dealing with what is quite clearly one of the most expansive and dramatic initiatives that the world has ever seen. We're already talking about close to $1 trillion of projects being on the cards, and something that seems, I mean, even Marshall Plan looks pretty weak compared to the scale and the intensity of what the Chinese are laying out. So let me begin by just putting this in a bit of a historic context. I would say, if you read Xi Jinping's speech on Monday morning or Sunday morning, essentially, of course, history is very important for this initiative, and the Chinese are evoking the grand history of Asia and Inner Asia, of the links between Europe and Asia, of the past Silk Road that connected China to Europe, to the Middle East, and to India through a network of roads and overland corridors that existed well into the 11th or 12th century. It's also evokes the maritime Silk Road, which is supposed to have connected the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean in the past. So the celebration of the past, that it's really restoring the spirit of the Silk Road, as Xi Jinping said, is of evocation of the historic connectivity that existed, and that it's being revived under the Chinese aegis at this point of time. So there was a connectivity in the past. It is not as if it is being done today, but the Chinese are evoking that sentiment to build something. What the Chinese don't talk about, of course, is the period, the colonial period, where actually a lot of these connections were established. I mean, everybody, we're still writing books against colonialism, so I don't want to get too much into that. But the fact is, Singapore, Hong Kong, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta were all products of colonialism. Today, when we talk about Chinese building new ports, that in the colonial period, that the rise of European capitalism saw the attempt at integrating the world through a phase of globalization. That natural resources had to be moved from one part of the world to the industrial production centers in Europe. This required contact, this required creation of, you want to call them Silk Roads, you want to call them maritime connections, whatever you want to call them. The fact is, what China is doing today was exactly what the British and the others did in the 19th century, of creating new ports, creating new commercial nodes, setting new licensing standards. So you had actually, the colonial period actually saw the expansive interaction of, reconnection of Europe and Asia that got submerged that got broken in the beginning of the medieval period. So it's not something again new. I mean, there is a second historical phase of the colonial period where the rise of colonialism, the European expansionism, actually integrated vast parts of the Eurasian landmass and of the oceans through a network of roads and corridors. What we're seeing then today is actually the third phase, because the scale and intensity of the effort that China has put across is quite dramatic, and I think that's what makes a difference. So it is not new, it is different only in the sense that it is far greater, ambitious, far more ambitious in scope, and unlike in the past where, as I said, Britain built an empire, absent-minded fit or whatever it is, that here is being done by design. I mean, a single leader of a communist party is saying this is a conscious, deliberate program to link the world under the auspices of the Chinese capital, the export of Chinese capital. Those of us in the region, of course, we also find export of Chinese labor, Chinese standards, and a whole lot of Chinese design to transform connectivity in the world. So therefore, this is quite new. And I think here it's also necessary to remember, I think, that before the Chinese phase began, I mean, I think if we go back to the 19th century, that the roads and rail networks, which is one important part of the thing today, if we go back to see the colonial period actually, and the 19th century as a whole, the Russians brought the railway line to a place called Termiz, I don't know how many of you have seen that. It's really all the way down, just north of Mazar-e-Sharif. Just now the Chinese have linked it. So the train is, recently Chinese train has come via Central Asia to Mazar-e-Sharif. But the old railway link in the 19th century was to a place called Termez, which is on the river Amu Darya, which borders today Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And the British Empire in India took the railway line to Quetta and Peshawar. So, and the gap is where today, of course, that gap remained, but the gap is where the Chinese are going to do things today. But the fact is, what we see as spectacular railway line projects, I mean, were done before by the rising powers. So Britain took the railway, GT road, I mean, from Madras, you could go to Peshawar, get into a train. You could go from the other side, get in at Peshawar and go to Calcutta. The railway lines were done before and is being done. If those of you remember some fiction, Berlin-Baghdad railway, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, that there were these massive infrastructure projects done in the expansionary phase of capitalism. But today, what the Chinese are bringing to the table is far more sweeping, far more ambitious. And I think that's what makes this phase different from the previous one. And the other aspect, I think, is the historically, if you look at it, there is a Chinese sensibility to infrastructure, which I think partly my critique of India is that independent India lost some of that sensibility to connectivity, which was deeply embedded in the Chinese national movement. Sun Yat-sen, who was the first Prime Minister of Republican China, when he was thrown out as the Prime Minister after barely a couple of years in the office, he wanted to be the railway minister. He said, I don't care for prime ministership, but make me the railway minister. Because he saw railways as the critical element that's going to integrate modern China, develop China, because it's about steel, it's about coal, it's about everything modern that you could bring to the table, and that the railways would be the great unifying force of China. And he drew lines on the map, I mean, of what China's plans to be to build railways. Some of those railway lines on the map, of course, came into India, to Africa, to the Middle East. So the sense of Chinese ambition of infrastructure is not something the Communist Party or Xi Jinping has discovered today, but that's quite deeply embedded in the way the Chinese looked at the world. And I think those of you can go back and look at Sun Yat-sen's map of the Chinese railways. In fact, what the CCP has done is to largely implement that today. This expansive notion of Chinese railways connecting anyone. And today when the CCP talks about you must get to Beijing from anywhere in China in 4 hours or 5 hours. It's also about unification. The railways were about unification. The railways were about integration. And today under Xi Jinping, of course, it's about railways taking you beyond your borders. So when we see in South Asia the railways coming to Tibet, now they want to take it into Nepal. They want to build one across Burma if they get the permission. So this idea that you need to take your infrastructure beyond your borders. This is really founded, it's not as if the initiative, the One Belt, One Road initiative was an abstract one. It actually builds on the so-called West Region Development Strategy. If you go back to the 1999-2000 period, where Chinese actually connect the far-flung regions with railways, oil pipelines, etc. And now all you're doing is now to push that across your frontiers. Because the foundation for internal integration, because once you had the Tibet railway coming, it's a matter of time taking it to Kathmandu. Or once you built the South Sinkiang railway to Kashgar, it's only a matter of time you took it across the Karakorams into Pakistan. So therefore, the foundation for the expansive connectivity was laid in the Go West strategy, and I think what we're seeing today is a consequence of that. So what we're having then, I think if we look at it in a historical sense, that a whole lot of circumstances have come together for the Chinese to elevate the initiative into one. It becomes both export of capital, export of infrastructure, and projection of power in a far more fundamental sense, much like the British Raj, which projected power through the Indian Ocean. What the Chinese today are doing, you want to call it only economic power, military power, whatever it is, there will be consequences, whether we like it or not. We have to deal with it. So the question for India is not whether we like the BRI or not, but the question is, what does India do? And there, I think that brings me to the second part. There, I'd say, look at it. What are India's problem with the BRI? Again, here, the Belt and Road, if you look at the map, the Chinese map, both come together in South Asia. The overland ones coming down Karachi on one side or to Chaktu in Burma on the other side, and the Maritime Silk Road coming to Colombo, Calcutta, which is the map which map which shows. So therefore, in a sense, if this is about integrating the Eurasian landmass and the Indo-Pacific, then the overland road, overland belt, and the maritime road actually converge around South Asia. So in some senses, whatever happens, we're going to be right in the middle of that. And this is not surprising because South Asia is in the center of the Indian Ocean. It also sits under in a map, Western China. That is, if this is about connecting Western China to rest of Eurasia, the South Asia is right at the bottom. And geography tells you whatever happens, Karachi will always be the closest point to Kashgar. Calcutta will always be closest to Lhasa. And the Yunnan, getting out of Yunnan, the closest points will always be in Burma. So that's geography. So now the question is how the Chinese are going to exploit that geography into doing things. For those of us sitting in India, I mean, I think whether it is CPEC in Pakistan, the BCIM corridor, that is Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor, which is on the east, or the much talked about Himalayan corridor, which brings the Chinese rail and road corridors from Tibet through Nepal into the Indo-Gangetic plain. So we had to deal with these three sets of proposals. It's not as if these were just outlined by Xi Jinping. In a sense, actually, many of these ideas and projects had already existed before. All that Xi Jinping has done is to put them all together into a coherent grand design. Because CPEC goes back, I mean, the Karakoram Highway goes back to the original agreement, I think, was 69. It was built in the 70s. Then it was opened in the early 80s. So the Karakoram, so we know about the Karakoram Highway and we had to deal with it. So the problem of POK, that every issue today we're talking about existed when we had to deal with the Karakoram Highway. When the Chinese PLA, in a spectacular feat, gotten across the Karakoram Mountains, which was at that point merely a strategic project. Today, of course, it has a whole lot of economic dimension. Similarly, the BCIM is again, I think, an invocation of the Southern Silk Road. Those of you familiar with the history, there is something called the Tea Horse Road, which brought tea from Yunnan into South Asia through the Eastern Himalayas. That is today what we're trying to do is the BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor. And the Trans-Himalayan route, anybody a bit familiar with Kathmandu, with the Benares, with the whole Buddhist circuit, that the links across the Himalayas, in the middle Himalayas, is also an old one, and I think the Chinese economic power is trying to do that again. So the Indian objections today are not new. When KKH, that is the Karakoram Highway, was initiated in the 70s, India did object, both in terms of what it was doing, to the question of India's territory being violated, and the Indians kept objecting to it formally. But today, of course, then it did not matter much at that time because the scale of the projects was fairly limited. But today, I think the problem is when it is the consequence of this great project are going to be so much that India's objections today to CPEC have become far more serious. Then similarly, the Trans-Himalayan corridor. One of the earliest roads the Chinese built in South Asia was the Kodari Highway, the Friendship Highway. That was the first thing with the Nepalese were playing the China card, if you want to call that. My dear, not too many Nepalese friends won't object to that. But the fact is that this again is not new. That it goes back to the 60s when the Chinese said, we'll come and build you this road. And the Nepalese took it up. India had to scramble and say, look, we'll do something else for you. So we built the horizontal road within Nepal. So since Nepal was our friend and we didn't want to cede ground to the Chinese, India put up money to do other roads. So what the play you're seeing today is not a new one. I mean, I think you got to see the context in which this took place. And there was this through the 60s and 70s. As China rose, China's economic power came to South Asia, that India had to respond to it in some form. But as I said today, the scale and scope of it is so dramatic. And the political campaign around it is so large. The president picks up the phone and talks to various people and say, look, this is my initiative, you got to come. So I think there is a kind of personal political prestige of Xi Jinping behind it, that the scale of it becomes, and that's precisely why India had to also deal with it with a very clear, specific response. If you look at the statement that India issued on Saturday, there are at least three aspects to its objections to the Belt and Road Initiative. One was that it violates India's sovereignty in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, that this is unacceptable. Therefore, we're not going to accept this project because it violates India's sovereignty over Pakistan occupied Kashmir. The second aspect, of course, is that the Chinese have not consulted us, that there have not been enough consultations, that the Chinese only come to and say, my way or highway. Look, this is my project. Are you with me or against me? Are we familiar with that? I mean, when Mr. Bush used to say that, you're with me or against me. So there was no room for, at least this is the Indian perspective, that there was no room for saying, yes, you take the whole thing, whole 9 yards, as we say in India, or you have to say no. So there's never a kind of a specific breakdown of discussions, but the Indian argument is that, look, there was not enough consultations. Because the Chinese don't agree with that. They say, no, we've tried, but the fact is that from the Indian perspective, at least, when they said, look, we want to know what it is, we want a detailed discussion, that discussion quite clearly has not taken place. While these two arguments were known before and were made by different people at the higher levels in India, it is the third point which has kind of attracted everybody's attention in Saturday's statement, which was a stinging attack on the statement in a barely one paragraph saying the CPEC does not CPEC, the BRI projects don't stand the scrutiny of global norms on infrastructure, on transparency, on accountability, on what it does to local communities, what it does to nations' indebtedness. I mean, when I see the Indian Foreign Office drafting skills are all there still. In one paragraph, if you could take down, criticize this in a fairly interesting summary of the criticism, which nobody else has made, I think, as far as I know, while people have made it in a far more detailed context. This actually lays out, this is not the way infrastructure is done in the rest of the world. This has been damaging to the people in the region, in wherever the projects have taken place. This, again, is not a new thing. I mean, I think India is familiar with the situation in Sri Lanka. If you go back to the Sri Lankan elections, 2014 or 2015, January, it was the opposition parties who are now in power who said the Chinese projects were unviable, who said this was about corruption, this is about the political patronage of President Rajapaksa, and that we are going to review it, we're going to change it, and we're not going to accept it. So the first thing they did, of course, when they got the election, is to suspend those projects. India had no role in this. I mean, it was entirely an intra-Lanka argument. The Lankan people said this undemocratic, unviable, corrupt, political, patronage that was what behind the projects. Of course, now the projects are going through, but we'll get back into that, why they're going through, but that's a different story. But the fact is, it was argument that was made by the Sri Lankan opposition, who are in power now. So therefore, the question of global norms and the Chinese projects, those of you who are going to do detailed studies of it, just look at the interest rates, because a lot of it is through, it's not like the ADB World Bank type of assistance, or not the Japanese type of assistance that we've seen. The interest rates are pretty high, commercial in some cases. So therefore, I think those arguments, have been made, but I think India has made them quite clearly. But beyond the stated fears, there are unstated fears. I just want to get into that, just mention at least 2 or 3 of them. One is, of course, that India feels that, look, this is not just about an economic project, this is about projecting Chinese political influence. And therefore, South Asia as a sphere of Indian influence, and that you're ceding primacy, you're losing that primacy within South Asia. Of course, we had lost it in Pakistan long ago, but then what's happening in the rest of the region is where the Chinese, penetration of Chinese economic, political influence, and therefore you got to draw a line somewhere and stand up to the kind of thing that is going to fundamentally undermine India's position within the South Asian subcontinent. Second point, I think, which has not often been made in clear terms, but it's been mentioned, is that if you take these projects, some choices are going to be hardwired into the future decision making. If there's a railway line in Nepal and Pakistan, the technical standards, the kind of things that come with large infrastructure projects are going to be set by the Chinese technology. And those are going to be very difficult to remove if those standards become the norms, and then what it does to the Indian business, Indian companies, of course, is a long-term challenge. So that's the second point that is under the Indian objection. A third is the fact, while most of the projects are presented as civilian, that many of them are dual uses, and they could become military projects. That is just the beginning with the camel and the Arab story, of course, that it is, at least from the Indian perspective, This is about the camel getting into the South Asian tent, and that once it creates military facilities within subcontinent, then I think you are talking about an entirely different phase of a competition with China. Therefore, this has to be contested, and that's precisely what India is doing. And I think there, as I said, I don't think whether India is isolated or not is not in the top of the minds of Delhi, because they see sometimes you have to stand up for your vital interests. And the question is that India has decided that you can't even fudge it, because last few years, Indians were saying, neither yes nor no, yes, maybe, very typically Indian, we can't say yes or no. But the fact is now we're saying no. It's just not acceptable. So I think we are in a new phase, both in relation to what the Chinese are doing in the region and how India is going to look at the Chinese power projection into the subcontinent. That brings me to the third set of issues, which is really, what does India do now? I think where we are today is that, for whatever reasons, I think the India's past neglect of or underestimation of the consequence of China's rise, even economic rise, that there are consequences today that you have to deal with it. And I think that is, and that if China's rise is seen as undermining India's economic and political position in the subcontinent, then I think the challenge then becomes a strategic one of how do you restore India's centrality and primacy within the subcontinent. And I think this in turn requires at least 3-4 things that India has neglected in the past, which this present government is trying to do. I think one is internal connectivity. It's one thing to say, look, at least the Chinese didn't stop us from making our roads, right? Nobody has stopped us from making roads inside India. So therefore, you now have to start doing internal connectivity. It was Mr. Vajpayee's government, as you know, sir, when the Golden Quadrilateral, the beginning of road construction. But, I don't want to criticize the UPA government, but the fact is, the last 10 years, we've seen a significant slowing down. And what this government is saying, look, we're going to put more money back into developing internal connectivity. Railways becomes a very important ministry, and we're going to put a lot of effort on internal connectivity, roads and railway networks. And linked to that is the question of linking your frontiers. Northeast, I can see, for long we said Northeast is going to be India's, and part of Luki's policy, but actually across the Brahmaputra till, barely one bridge. Today, if they see the focus on restoring, expanding infrastructure in the frontier regions, railway line, to Kashmir, for example. 1893, I think, if my memory is right, when Maharaja of Kashmir wanted a railway line. 1893 was also when India actually built a railway line to Tinsukia in Assam. And it's taken us 120 years. We still don't have a railway into Kashmir. I'm not getting into the substantive issues, but the fact is, where were you, my friend? That it's not a rocket science that integrating your own country through rail and road networks, whether it's the British Raj or before that Sher Shah Suri, that we've neglected the attempt at connecting our own frontiers. And therefore, privileging frontier connectivity today has become an important policy with the Indian government at this point of time. The third, India has one of the longest coastlines, but the number of ports we have, global ports, barely 2. JNPT barely gets into the top 50 ports. Well, the Chinese have 10 out of the top 50. Chinese have 8 or 9 or 10. I don't know how many. It is the top 10. They have 8 container ports are Chinese. And all this has happened in 30 years. Well, India's tradition is much older. That the idea of Sagarmala, that you need to rebuild your coastline with ports, or as the PM calls, port-led economic development, is again something that was neglected in the past, we're trying to do. Then comes to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. If you just see what Chinese have done with the Hainan Island, in a short period of time, Hainan today hosts a submarine pen, some of the best resorts in the world. Therefore, this idea that your own territorial assets begin to develop them. And this is not, nobody else is stopping you from doing it. And therefore, the question of developing your own internal connectivity and the frontier connectivity has become a higher priority. And we should really thank the Chinese for at least forcing the pace on some of these things. Related to this, of course, is do you do it alone or do you do it in partnership? One of the interesting things that's happened in the last few years is the idea that, look, India can work with US and Japan to promote regional connectivity. that we talked about an Indo-Pacific corridor. The Obama-Modi statement talked about it. But really, Americans have talked about Silk Road, but they don't have the money to make much out of it. But the Japanese have money, and they're interested. And the Japanese today have a Silk Road fund of their own. The Japanese propaganda is not as good as the Chinese one, and they don't have a Communist Party ruling. So therefore, what you have, the Japanese have put as much money, they've got $140 billion under the so-called Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. And they're saying, look, this money is available for infrastructure building in the regions of Asia or the Indo-Pacific. And I think today, finally, India and Japan are talking whether they can work together to do some of these projects. And I think we're seeing some of that happen in Sri Lanka, where they talk about India, Japan working together in Trincomalee, or India, Japan working together in Bangladesh. At least you're beginning to see some interesting combination, because both India and Japan have an interest in limiting the Chinese forays into this part of the world. Does this mean that it's something fundamentally we're going to make this a point of permanent contestation with China? I mean, I don't think India is going to do that. My sense is India is caught in a situation where you can't build a great wall around China. The Chinese can build it, but we can't build it against the Chinese. So therefore, the second largest economy, you cannot stop engaging the Chinese. So therefore, I think whatever arguments that India has had is still kept it at a polite level, is open for an engagement, discussion with the Chinese. So therefore, you got to come to terms with the fact that the Chinese will do this infrastructure. Some of it will get built, rightly or wrongly, and a lot of it will be in our neighborhood. So I think that's a reality that we have to deal with. So the BRI is a train that has left the station, and it will keep moving. So therefore, there are possibilities for India both to cooperate with the Chinese as well as compete with them. If the Chinese are willing to put money and build a train, right now they're doing a study on Chennai-Delhi high-speed train. I don't know how many thousands of crores it will cost. But the fact is, if he's willing to put that money, should I say no just because it's the color of the money is not right? So the question, I think, for too long, much of the discourse on BRI becomes this abstract, grand thing of BRI, are you for it or against it? But if there is a specific discussion of this is the project, this is the interest rate, this is how it will get paid back, then we are in a different negotiation. I think that negotiation with China, where possible, must continue, and I think Delhi seems to be open for that. So therefore, I think the question on global norms that India has talked about, that is, in India that is active with Japan, both either unilaterally or collaborating with the Japanese, if we say Chinese are not following global norms, then we should be able to show there are better norms. That is, if I'm going to do the Trincomalee port tomorrow with the Japanese, and if I can show the difference between the costs of Godda port or costs of Trincomalee port, the term, interest rates is not a difficult thing to find out. I mean, that itself will tell you the difference between how Chinese are doing it, what we must do it. So therefore, in India, that provides an alternative, not merely saying Chinese are bad, their projects are terrible, of demonstrating a clear, credible alternative model to the BRI projects will have huge effect, a lot more than the slogans and statements that India makes. So therefore, I think, and I think it's good for the neighboring countries as well. If I were Sri Lanka, if I were Pakistan, if I was Bangladesh, if I can see the alternative terms, then I think you are in a real argument, not this abstract argument, Indians bad, Chinese good, or Chinese bad, India good. But I think for that, you got to demonstrate concretely the fulfillment of a specific project in a specific country, and those terms are transparent and open for everyone to see. And that will have an impact on the decision makers within the neighborhood, and that is important. So therefore, the MEA statement, the Foreign Office statement, refer to at least 4 or 5 major initiatives on BBIN, connectivity projects, Iran Chabahar project, and 3 or 4 things like that. And if we can demonstrate success even in one of these projects, then I think India's case would be far more effective than it is today. So let me conclude this by just reflecting on one important thought. I think one of the tragedies of independent India's evolution has been, this is my view, that it has largely neglected the territorial imperative. That this idea that consolidating territory, which has always driven the Chinese notions, was put largely secondary in the Indian context, that today, even today, we're talking about building a railway line into the northeast, into Kashmir, or through the Maoist areas in the in the heartland were affected by Naxalite violence, that these should have been straightforward, logical, economic and security thing, that this should have been the priorities. But the fact is that that finally I think we are waking up to the territorial imperative that integrating your own territory, markets, we've just done the GST, of building roads in your own territory is a huge strategic, of great strategic importance, and I think there's a discovery of that. Second, I think the British Raj left us in a reasonably integrated markets. India-Nepal had an open border. India-Sri Lanka had open trading. And that what partition and Indian socialism did was actually to disconnect these markets through conscious choice. Partition was not a conscious choice, but socialism was a conscious choice. If you're not interested in imports and exports, you're not interested in roads to Nepal or keeping the Nepal infrastructure in a good shape. I mean, some of you from Eastern UP or BR know what the state of the infrastructure between India and Nepal is. But today, I think that integrating our own market and integrating South Asia then becomes strategic goals, and pursuing them has become quite central. That again, I think is a positive. And finally, to keep saying sovereignty or Kashmir is meaningless. If you don't develop if you have control over a territory and are not doing anything about it, what's the big deal then? I mean, so therefore, I think to match the rhetoric on sovereignty with actual development, because nobody's contesting Andaman sovereignty, but then we've just neglected it. Today, I think this government is trying to do something about Andaman. So therefore, I think that matching the references to sovereignty with actual development on the ground of strategic territories that India has, I think is a fundamental thing. And I would say at least these three levels today, Modi's, the new government's emphasis, because actually we talked about connectivity for the last 20 years. But I think there is a political will today, a sense of recognition that China, if you don't do it, the Chinese are going to do it for you. Just give them some time. So therefore the question then, I think what China has done is to really shake India out of its stupor in terms of connectivity and to force it now to actually draw a line, stand up, oppose the Chinese initiative, at least on things where it matters, and begin to do things more seriously. How successful it is, maybe we will talk about it next time I come, but I think at this point, there seems to be surprising new will to actually take on the Chinese, and I think this is something I haven't seen this approach in a long time. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Raja, and we are left with plenty of time for a very exhaustive and engaging discussion. Raja, would you prefer collecting questions or three at a go? Okay. So 3 at a go, please do indicate to me so that I can identify you, and please introduce yourselves as well. Yes, Dr. Subbarao.
Thank you very much and for explaining India's grievances or objections. Actually, I have 4 questions, but very crisp and short, I hope. The first one is, can India's grievances be redressed at all? Or are they so intransigent that there is no meeting point at all? You know, for example, saying that if you're passing a corridor through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and you're impinging on our sovereignty, that's a problem that China cannot accommodate. So is India just sulking for the sake of sulking, or should India be more practical? The second question is, should India have remained outside of the meeting? I asked this from what's the recent history. America is kept out of AIIB and has come to grief because of that, because the criticism against America has been that you should have come inside and raised your objections, you would have been more effective. Nobody is talking about India being out of that Beijing conference yesterday, right? Just it's news only in India. Nowhere outside India is it news that India is not there in the conference. So should India not have locked itself into an impossible situation and actually gone there, made its presence felt, and made its objection? The third question I have is a bit more involved, which is about India's objection to BRI. You spoke about it and you said that India should demand that what China is doing conforms to best international practices and show that what they're doing, what India is doing outside of India, conforms to those practices. Actually, I think it's important to say this, not just about best practices, but in a larger context, which is that for the last 60 years, we have this aid imperialism. Donor countries, rich countries are given aid, not for projects that recipients want most, but for projects that donors most want to give. Example, in India, we got aid for power projects because our donor countries wanted to give employment and production to their power plant facilities. The criticism against China and the BIR, the new acronym, is that China is doing exactly that. It's not what other countries want, it's what China wants. It's to their best advantage and there's no matching. And if you put India to this test, you know, it's not prospective. In fact, we have quite a bit of history of giving aid in Africa. And India's aid to Africa does not conform to the internationally accepted ODA practices. So with what credibility can India say that China's BIR must conform to whatever best practices when in our own track record we've not conformed? My final question is very short, which is, do you endorse India's stand?
Does it really matter? When was it?
It does to us at least.
I think there's two. I think I'll answer this one. No, I think the first one. I think whether we should have gone to the conference or not. I mean, I think this really, that story is over. That event is over. I mean, I don't think the loss of not being there is not of great consequence. The question is that you still have the BRI. I mean, I think that is the fact. So whether you've gone inside, you know, okay, the choice is you stay outside and, you know, criticize them, go inside and rain on their parade. You know, it really doesn't, I mean, as you said, look, it's not consequential. I agree with you fully. This is not going to stop the BRI. So the Chinese will keep doing what they're doing, especially in Pakistan. The grievances, as I said, look, it's not a question of whether you're just claiming sovereignty. That's not going to stop the Chinese. It didn't stop the Karakoram highway. It's not going to stop the CPEC. It is, that story will, they keep doing what they're doing, at least in cases like Pakistan where they have solid support from the government, whichever the government is in power. Therefore, so the question is not, therefore, of merely expressing, that's a legal position, like the Chinese. When your president goes to Arunachal Pradesh, the Chinese are saying, why are you going there? It's none of your business, this is my territory, I'm going to rename your territories for you. So there is that is a declaratory part. Chinese can't take away Arunachal from you right now, at least. What is missing, I think, for us has been that what are you doing about developing Arunachal? Why didn't you build roads in Arunachal? That is the question. I mean, so therefore, there are some parts of the Indian critique are quite clearly declaratory, saying, because you have to keep saying every time the Chinese do something in Kashmir, you say, no, it belongs to me. But that has no operational consequence. But I think the operational consequence will come if you do your projects. Chinese are the same Chinese who tell us, why are you making such a big deal about sovereignty in Kashmir? Will have exactly the opposite position when it comes to Arunachal Pradesh. Forget building a project. They stopped us, ADB, from giving us money. They won't let you go in there. I mean, of course, anybody political. I'm not even talking about Dalai Lama. So therefore, they themselves have two different sets of arguments. So I think the key is not, you know, whether you're in a meeting room reading one speech written by the MEA is of little consequence. The question is, what do you do on the ground? There, I think your third question, I think, is far more important. What is your best, are you following best practices? There, I think, having said this, I think at least you've got to demonstrate a lot of aid. Look, I have no problem seeing that Indians and Chinese are going to do exactly what the British and the French and the Americans have done. That's part of the problem of rising power, of emerging powers. But within that paradigm, can India demonstrate today to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh, that look, we can do projects on better terms than the Chinese? That's the only question. There, I think, is that if we do the Trincomalee project, we do get it, or if we get some port project in Bangladesh, can we demonstrate that India, Japan have better terms? It is the Japanese have demonstrated to us what the money they're giving us for the Mumbai-Ahmedabad project is throwaway prices, almost free. If we can do, you know, better than the Chinese, that itself, I mean, is a reasonable advantage. I'm not talking about a fundamental philosophical conception, but you got to show to the clients in the region, I mean, who are looking for infrastructure money, that there are alternatives to the Chinese. And once they have the alternative, they themselves are going to negotiate with the Chinese very hard. And that's going to make the Chinese probably better partners. And for India, I think the real question is, if it does projects, its ability to negotiate with the Chinese and do things will improve. Therefore, I say, do more, demonstrate your capability to do better projects. I would say that will have the consequences and necessary desired effects than all the statements that we make.
I have Jivanta, Dipinder, and we can take Rupak. Okay, in that order. Jivanta.
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Rajamohan. If I'm correct, in the statement it said that India takes a principled position on this issue. In the past, when India referred to principles, it was seen as a position of weakness. In your opinion, at this moment in time, is India in a position of strength arguing this? And particularly, what is India's leverage over China right now? Not in the long term, but right now.
Thank you, Mr. Rajamohan. I'm going to take the perspective of a devil's advocate.
Sure, please do.
Are we making too much of a Hollywood mega blockbuster out of this entire BRI? And my contention is, if you look at the funding, an overwhelming proportion is coming from commercial banks in China. The big four are providing about 110 billion. The development bank, China Development Bank, which is commercial, about another 150, and there's a piffling amount coming from the AIIB, from the New Silk Road Fund, and the BRICS Bank. I mean, those are less than 10 billion. Internal stability in the banking system is far more important than projecting this. I mean, this was largely initially seen as an effort to utilize, to draw upon the excess capacity in steel, the falling prices, and sell this and project this into the developing economies which are dire infrastructure deficits. Now, Japan stepped in a big way for geopolitical concerns with similar funding. So why is this being, I'm curious about why this is being perceived as a golf club, either you get in or you're perpetually out. Indonesia, for instance, Sri Mulyani, if my memory serves me right, recently mentioned this is wonderful having the Japanese step in. Exactly. Let them compete with each other and give us the best deal. Sure. I mean, there's no entry limit to the time point. The other point I'm a little baffled about is the comparison with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was to help the US agenda to help rebuild Western Europe, more ravaged. Most of the assistance was not material. It was basically helping to getting the policy framework right. These already advanced market economies doing very well prior to the Second World War. So it was more of policy intervention and building up what eventually led to the Washington Consensus. So the direct stake was very limited, whereas the BRI is coming in, at least in the public view, with a very definitive geopolitical agenda. It just gets you on view now. Thank you.
Rupak?
Thank you, Professor Rajamohan, for an excellent lecture. I just want to ask you a question on the India-Japan collaboration in the infrastructure front. The Indian-Myanmar trilateral highway has been running behind schedule. It was scheduled to be scheduled to be completed in 2016. Then it says 2018. So things like this, as Dr. Subbarao had said, can we not fasten the speed of projects like this, because this shows the country in bad light. And with regards to the other thing, India and the annual conference of the African Development Bank is being held in Ahmedabad these days, and the Japanese Minister of State for Finance is being represented. So do you see India and Japan coming together on the infrastructure front in Africa as well?
No, I mean, not to ask a question really, but to point out certain things. Professor Rajamohan, excellent talk. It interests me also because I come from Bangladesh, which is very, very involved in this, with this initiative. at a seminar in Dhaka, it was said that the government of Bangladesh was not present in the conference, by the way, in Beijing. But they said that every Bangladeshi in spirit was. Because this has created a tremendous enthusiasm in the country among all the interest groups, the army, the bureaucracy, the planning commission, the civil society, etc. Now, some figures that they have given me are as follows, and this is slightly not in contradiction with what you're saying. Well, okay. The terms, broadly, 40 years, 10 years grace, across the board, 2% interest. Advantages, no technical assistance program, which are normally written into all these aid agreements we do with the bank and World Bank, etc. So in terms of norms, the Bangladeshis, as of now, do not see that these as more difficult than what they have already entered into. Quite on the contrary, they see it as far, far more attractive. The other thing is that AIIB, unlike the ADB, is not a development bank. So they come into, they've already brought in $500 million in projects without too many, this thing about pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, etc. The other thing is, in terms of utilization, project preparation. Now, the projects they have picked up in Bangladesh are those approved projects. I mean, it's not that projects are being prepared now. As you know, we have a huge list of projects. I would assume that they are following this model in many other countries. So I just wanted to put this into proper perspective from the point of view of actual implementation in the field. Thank you.
I mean, I won't certainly grudge your enthusiasm for the BRI. I mean, I think Bangladesh is a sovereign country, sovereign people. So, you know, look.
No, not I
yeah.
people.
No, yeah, so that's okay. I mean, so look, the whole lot of people are very enthusiastic about it. I think India can't stop them from, you know, doing more projects with them, because we couldn't stop the Sri Lankans. Sri Lankans said it was bad. Then the new guys came and said, okay, we'll change the terms, renegotiate the terms. I mean, it's entirely intra-Lanka argument. So we are not trying to stop other people, because in any case we can't, even if we want to stop. So I'm not even making that case, as one of the colleagues there said, look, I don't know the details about what rate you borrowed, but the idea that a lot of it is closer to the commercial rates. Some parts, large important projects, are that rates, and I think that's part of the problem. That is an argument that's being made not by Indians, but a lot of people in different parts of the world. So that you can check specific facts with specific projects. I don't have that data. Second, I think I agree with you fully. Look, it is, when the Emperor Xi makes it a prestige, of course it's a big deal. Bells and whistles, and, you know, if you're in a think tank, I just have to put those 4-letter word into God, beauty, and obor. I'll get money for it. I mean, that the entire CCP, entire Chinese state machinery today is ready to fund anything, but the leader wants promotion of Belt and Road. And the entire system is ready to support that. But the next guy will do it, who knows? I mean, each secretary had its own fancies, but this guy has this fancy. So right now, Chinese are making a big deal out of it. The rest of us are merely adapting to this big debate of China. And then because the Chinese have made it such a big diplomatic deal, everybody will say, are you for it or against it? So that is today tells you about the Chinese power. It doesn't tell you others are making it. Look, in Americans didn't like it. Last minute they sent someone. Japanese didn't like it. Last minute they sent someone. So that stuff will go on. But in the end, what matters, as you rightly said, what are the terms? Where is the beef? What is the rate of interest? That is the key question. Now, if it suits Bangladesh and Maldives to take money at whatever rate the Chinese are offering, please do. I mean, nobody can stop it, right? And if there's $1 trillion on offer, and the Chinese can give you fantastic deals like that, take it. But I think, as I said, Sri Lanka itself objected to it. A lot of other people in different parts are objecting to it. So it becomes political, therefore. And I think, I have no doubt, I fully agree with you, that a large part of it is geopolitical. And I think that's why the problem is going to be for India, and not merely saying this is an infrastructure project. Chinese submarines showed up at Colombo port. What Indians are telling Sri Lankans is, look, 70% of your traffic through Colombo comes to me. I think you must listen to at least my concerns. Or you must give me a share of the pie. or the Japanese are telling the Sri Lankans, look, we built the original Colombo port. We need another shot at making this better. So I think, so there will be politics now. And that's what is happening. But I think it won't go uncontested. Even if it's only India and Japan that are going to do it, they will do it because I think for India and Japan, I mean, they see their vital interests at stake. And they'll try and see what competition they can offer, which I think is good for Bangladesh, good for Sri Lanka. If you can say, look, two guys competing and saying, I'll give you better terms, more the merrier. So I would say, bring on the good times, as they say in the United States. I mean, I think on the question of principled and leverage, look, you should take every word the MEIS say. Everything we say is principled, right? So I think it's not a question of saying it's principled or leverage. I think there is no leverage against the Chinese, period. That doesn't mean I should go there and clap for it. That's all they're saying. Look, don't expect me to come. What leverage India has is to demonstrate it can do other things. So the leverage will come and India demonstrate Trincomalee can be built on better terms than Gwadar port. That's when you create leverage. Right now there is no leverage. And nor is India looking for leverage. So the question is, because this affects India's vital interests, because this promises to transform India's strategic geography, because it promises to bring Chinese military closer to my borders, do I act or not act? That is the question. Some things you can't stop. If the Chinese are going to deploy a brigade of 1,000 Chinese Marines in Gwadar, there's nothing India can do about it. But, my God, they're going to put pressure on the Sri Lanka and say, look, we're not going to let you bring in the Chinese nuclear submarines into Colombo. So it depends on the situation. So the question is, what has changed with this, thanks to Xi Jinping, is finally India saying, my geography is changing. I was so worried about the American presence. Now I'm seeing it as the Chinese who are entering my neighborhood. Therefore, I got to do something about it. That's all that is the change. The rest of it is words.
Okay. I'm trying to spot more hands. Yes, sir, please. Do identify yourself, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Raja. My name is Siwage Negara from ISAS-Yusof Ishak Institute.
Right.
So I have two questions. The first one is related to whether you see there's a contradiction between India's decision to join AIIB with the decision not to join One Belt One Road. Do you see that this is a contradiction in terms of Indian stance? And then the second question is whether you can share the view from the business viewpoint, like in India's business, whether India business see that this is a missed opportunity for India to join this One Belt One Road.
Yes. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Priyalal from Global Union. I have just one comment and a question. I think you were mentioning about the retaining the sovereignty and about the connectivity. I mean, what I feel is the BRI project, the Chinese strategy, they are coming up with a strategy with a structure. Whereas, in all other trade agreements that were mooted around TPP, RCEP, yes, they had certain trading strategies, but they didn't have a proper structure. Whereas BRI, it is with a structure. So my question is, in this, because if you really see what is China is telling the rest of the world, come join us, this is for everyone. So we are helping you to be part of this so that the benefits will be shared. So my question is, taking that into account, whether the connectivity supersedes sovereignty of the nations.
James?
James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School. A question in two parts. The first is, do you... Oh, sorry. I take this point about what India needs to do about internal connectivity, but do you think it's going to happen? I suppose it's fine enough to say that that's what should happen, but do you think that the presence of One Belt, One Road is going to be enough to sort of put more resources into these projects? And I suppose the analogous question is it a big enough threat to have the same thing happen around the region? I mean, so thinking about Sri Lanka, for instance, it always struck me that after the Rajapaksas were kicked out, that India had a fantastic opportunity to do a bit of Chinese-style diplomacy and just sort of throw some money at Sri Lanka and kind of, improve relations, which it basically didn't do. I mean, there were a few projects, but not very much. And so now Ranil has had to go back to the Chinese again, looking for money. And I suppose I wondered whether you thought whether the sort of threat of this project was seen as sufficiently grave to sort of kickstart a different type of more sort of mercantile diplomacy along Chinese lines within its own region to try and kind of win friends and build ties.
I know, James, you had to leave, so let me answer your question first. I mean, look, I think all evidence, I think at this point, internally, this government seems to be devoting more resources to internal connectivity, trying to accelerate a large number of projects which were initiated under the previous government or the one before that. But I think certainly stepping up the gas on promoting internal connectivity, whether it is the ports, whether it is the roads, whether it is the railway networks. I mean, if you go to the northeast, you see a lot more activity today that's going on. I mean, in Andamans, there is at least some effort at reviving some of that activity. So I think there is the beginnings of how effective, I don't know, Dr. Subbarao can tell us better, how effective even a government's declared policy will be on the ground. We don't know. But quite clearly, there's more political will and more commitment to improve internal connectivity, and especially frontier connectivity, that there is certainly more going on. In terms of when it comes to mercantile diplomacy, there's no way India can compete with China. The Chinese say, look, I got $1 trillion and I'm going to throw it around. I got $4 trillion, now it's come down to 3 of foreign currency reserves, and I'm going to... there's no way India can compete with this kind of game, both in space, certainly. But could it have done more in Sri Lanka? My sense is, look, once the regime change took place in Sri Lanka, the new government, after suspending the projects, is back in negotiation with the Chinese. What the Chinese have offered to renegotiate some terms, I don't know if the best terms, but nevertheless, some adjustments are being made. And that is something, how the Chinese have the kind of influence that they have today, that it's not going to be easy to reverse all of that. So the question is not for India to, how do I reverse the Chinese projects, but can I do projects? There, I think, I don't know if you've seen the text of it, Sri Lanka, India, recent MOU. They at least talk about 4 or 5 major projects, including a LNG terminal, a LNG gas-fired power plant, the Trincomalee port. There are at least 4 or 5 major contracts. I don't know how long. And Indian business is actually, somebody asked about Indian business, does it serve Indian business interests? So finally, India is mobilizing because they said, if we don't do anything now, then your problem in Sri Lanka is going to be a lot more. And I think Sri Lanka is in a good situation to actually be able to, pass this between Delhi and Beijing. So you have actually, Vikram Singhe comes to Delhi, goes back to receive the PM, moment is finished, he's caught a flight to Beijing. So it gives options for everyone. But at least we're in the game giving those options. We were not in the game. After all, we slept on Hambantota port. That we allowed it, for all the evil things we say about Rajapaksa, actually offered the deal to India and we didn't take it. So I think a lot of projects like that which are around, this government at least seems there's a will to force things happen. I would say Sri Lanka is a test case. If the MOU, I believe, has specific timelines listed out, end of May, contract will be signed, end of May, end of June, there'll be MOU signed. If those projects materialize, I would say then India is acting, getting something out of this. And that itself is huge progress, given the state, the way we generally tend to operate. So that's where we are. But on competition, I think we shouldn't even think about competing with China on the scale of money and the kind of things they bring. That brings me to the question of, I don't know if it's structure. They got more money. Money talks. The rest of it is secondary. So there's no way India can bring the money. But I think you posed an interesting question on sovereignty and connectivity. I can tell you this much. At the 19th century subcontinent, sovereignty was valued more than connectivity. And that's why Afghanistan does not have roads. Because those on the periphery of this expanding empire said connectivity means loss of sovereignty. Therefore, don't connect. In fact, one of the Afghan kings, anybody who went on British railways would have his legs cut off. Make sure no trains will come. And that's why the Russian line stopped in Termez, The Indian line stopped at Quetta and Peshawar. And Afghanistan security was premised on lack of connectivity. And India's own approach, that don't build roads in Arunachal Pradesh because it's not good, or the Chinese will walk down, that was about security at the expense of connectivity. But those ideas are gone today. That today you have to, if you don't connect, you have a bigger problem. So I think that dilemma has been resolved. The reason why Northern Burma, why Tibet, why Afghanistan chose disconnectivity above was more important than connectivity was because sovereignty had to be protected. But today the Chinese capitalism is crashed through all this, is flattening the Himalayas. So we have to deal with it. It's a new world out there. And I think that option does not exist anymore. On the AIB, I think it's a very good question. You are right, actually, India made a mistake. In my view, I think the Indians made a complete misjudgment on the BRICS and on the AIB. What was the argument that India was making? India was making the Western-led unipolar world and Bretton Woods system was a threat, and we will work with the Russians and the Chinese and create an alternative universe. Right? That was the argument of multipolarity, and multipolarity demanded new economic institutions. Nobody is going to say this in Delhi, but I think you jump from the frying pan into the fire. Welcome to the Chinese-led multilateral institutions. So it is there, but although the government of India will tell you, we're there, we see we're not totally against the Chinese, but I think what was the reason we joined, we put in our money in AIB, by putting our money in NDB, was because you thought, because the assumption was that the principal threat to India's economy and security came from the West. I don't think anybody will buy that argument in Delhi today. Your problem is the Chinese power, Chinese capital around us. So that contradiction will remain. Now, but problem is governments can't walk back or accept that they made a mistake. And that's the reason why even from the previous government said, okay, we'll live with CPEC. It might be actually be good for Pakistan because it will help Pakistan develop. That will be good for us. But this government has taken a completely different position, saying CPEC is unacceptable. We're going to compete hard with the Chinese on regional infrastructure. So this is a fundamental change. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to shut shop on BRICS or the AIB, but I think the priority is quite clearly is elsewhere. And if you're saying, look, we're going to work with the Japanese to build infrastructure in South Asia, it doesn't matter whether we're in AIB or BRICS. And after all, I think the political decision to compete has been made. So the rest of it, we'll have to manage the contradiction. Those contradictions are not going to disappear.
We have at least 15 minutes of time, so time for a second round, time for new questions. Raja, if I can add to the conversation by asking a somewhat speculative question. We talk about countries having views on these particular initiatives, like we are talking about the Indian view of the BRI and so on and so forth.
Indian government.
Exactly. This is where I was, trying to come to. That are we taking these things as very homogeneous? In the sense that I'm just trying to give a couple of examples. The European Union has not agreed to the joint communique on certain points, saying that there is a question of transparency, there is an issue with the way the standards are defined. But then there are European states which have enthusiastically participated in the conference. Similarly, Australia is hesitant to commit to the BRI, but then there are voices within Australia which are suggesting that this could be a good project for developing the infrastructure of Northern Australia, in areas like Darwin, for example. There has been, in this connection, a conversation in India that there are reports that have come out in the media that the West Bengal Chief Minister wanted to join the conference.
They would have said, oh, dead bodies.
And she wasn't given permission. We are not going to get into whether that's right or wrong, but I just wanted to sum this up in a broader way, and you made this very interesting point that whether we should judge funds by their color. Do you see the possibility down the line, sub-federal governments lobbying in India for a changed posture on this with the federal government, particularly when it comes to India's east coast, where the requirement of funds is very high and the Chinese could actually be, a willing collaborator? Do you see that kind of a possibility emerging down the line?
Not in the near future. I don't see very much chance of it. The central government is going to quite decidedly hold on to its view of, when it comes to foreign relations. It's nice to talk about federalism, but the line has been drawn, and that there's too much of a political issue. Yeah. Look, India has diverse views. I mean, there's no question of half the newspapers are attacking the government for not going. So a lot of people feel that, look, is India doing the right thing? A lot of people are not convinced. So that's fine. I mean, so that view exists. But within the governments, I mean, I think once the central government takes a call like this, there's no question now of West Bengal doing its own thing or somebody else doing their own thing. The problem has not been lack of money. So it is not a question of, it is lack of money that is holding up projects. If you have will and are willing to move forward, money is available for doing a whole lot of infrastructure projects. So I don't see that the Chinese money, because Chinese willing to give on same interest rates as the Japanese, sure, of course they'll take it. But that doesn't mean they're going to soften this posture. That is one part. Second, look, Americans can decide, for them it's a political issue, right? They can say, look, Australians, Americans can say, okay, let's at least send one guy to talk to them. But when India says, look, Kashmir is involved or Arunachal Pradesh is involved, he's not going to say, look, he can take a relaxed view. So there is no comparison. Look, I think because sovereignty has been put in the central argument, there is not that flexibility. But I believe, so you ask me what is my view, I think we should keep up the door open for dialogue, because it's not the end of the road, because this story is going to continue. I think far more deeply, what BRI has done is to bring to the fore all the elemental issues that have divided India and China. One is about territoriality, sovereignty. There is both the questions of Kashmir and Arunachal. Second, the nature of the relationship with Pakistan. So these are big issues. I mean, once these issues are on the table, and more importantly, what does Chinese power mean to me in South Asia, in India? If Chinese economic power, as we've seen in the case of Pakistan, if tomorrow Sri Lanka buys jet fighter aircraft, the Pakistanis and the Chinese are willing to sell it to them almost for free. Those are some goods do come free. So you are at a point where the Chinese military economic power is posing questions to the central government in Delhi. Do we finally say no and do something about it, or you take this accommodations? That I think the previous government was willing to maybe do both the things, but this government, for good or bad, they've decided, line has been drawn, and that we will contest Chinese play for. We couldn't do it in Pakistan. You can't do it in Afghanistan because there is no border. But in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Bangladesh, you will contest for infrastructure, you will contest for political influence, you will contest for strategic presence. So I think.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to join issues on the comment you made. Under India's constitution, states cannot contract foreign loans or even take foreign grants. All of it is very heavily controlled by the central government. So whatever aid comes in whatever form, whatever is the grant element, all of that has to be approved by government, central government. But that still does not stop states from directly negotiating with donor agencies. There are donor agencies like, for example, West Bengal or Andhra Pradesh or Kerala could talk to Japan government or talk to Danish government or talk to DFID in Britain or the USAID or indeed the World Bank or the ADB. Some of this dialogue is purely in economic terms. Some states want aid from the World Bank because World Bank aid is considered to be certain quality. Some states want Japanese aid because the grant element is higher. Okay. So, however, it has to be approved by the central government. Okay. That's the first point. Because there is so much of inequity across different aid agencies giving aid on different terms, Government of India used to earlier intermediate. No matter on what terms the loan came, from the central government to the state government, it used to be uniform terms. State protested against that. So now it comes in whatever terms the World Bank gives, the state gets it on the same terms, but they cannot directly contract. If you permit, I want to make another comment on AIIB. You made the point. I agree with your conclusion that India should not have gone into AIIB, but not for the reason you mentioned. I think India was completely upstaged on AIIB. Because for about 5 years, we've been talking about the BRICS Bank. You know, in all the BRICS meetings, we talk about it. India was quite reluctant. Indeed, all the 4 BRICS countries except China. China was the only country which was enthusiastic. The Russians didn't even understand what the hell was going on. Okay, because most of the time they had no interpreters, so the discussion was going on and they didn't know what the hell was going on. Nobody was interested. The BRICS Bank came, you know, but it's an idea that floated around for 3-4 years and reached a certain level. Then India signed up to it. Then the Chinese realized that in the BRICS Bank, nomenclature NDB now, they have to share patronage, management, everything with Russia, with Brazil, with India, and South Africa. That are not acceptable to them. So they upstaged all the other 4 BRICS countries and started AIIB 6 months before BRICS Bank. It's for that reason that India should have walked out of it and should have in fact told the other 3 BRICS countries, apart from India, to collectively walk out of it and protest against AIIB. We missed that opportunity.
It's very interesting what you said. I mean, I think it's not well known aspects.
Malcolm?
Hi, Malcolm Cook from next door at ICS. I wanted to ask you to extend a little bit. I'm wondering, how are India's South Asian neighbors using the BRI initiative and China's greater interest in playing a leadership role to try to renegotiate their relationships with India? So are they trying to play China off India for their own benefit as well? Thanks.
Sir, High Commissioner.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan. It was a brilliant talk and a very balanced one. You know, the advice and the bottom line that emerges from your talk, that is a very balanced view. I was just thinking, you know, whether within the Indian establishment there is some strand of thinking that pay heed to the views that you expressed today here on this forum. Thank you.
So you're saying,
is there some thinking within the Indian government that pays some heed to your views that you expressed today? Thank you.
Any further? I'll answer that question. Yeah. Any further last questions?
So let me answer the question.
Raja, please. Yeah.
No. I think what one is trying to do is actually interpret what government is doing. I mean, I think it's quite clearly the previous government had a different view. They were willing to live with, you know, the kind of influence that China was doing, and that they could manage it. But I think this government has taken a much harder position. So therefore, you could see I mean, it's not a new things that I'm saying, but I'm only putting it in a context, in a historical context, which is missing in the general public debate. Very few people know the Karakoram highway issue that goes back to 69, or the Kodari highway goes back to 60s. So I think there's a long story here, and that even within the Chinese context, there has been the longer story of, it was Jiang Zemin in 1999 who talked about West Region Development Strategy. That the idea of extending, you know, railway lines to Kashgar, to Lhasa, to Yunnan, these have been around. I think what Xi Jinping has done is to package it all together into this one gigantic project, put his political prestige online, and the CCP goes on this massive propaganda offensive. So that's why it's become such a big deal, and everybody has to talk about it. I mean, they even set up a BRI, Institute for the Study of BRI, or you name it. I mean, it's like you know, it's like you say in South Asia we say, you know, when the Sultan or Maharaja decides something has to be done, it'll be done. I mean, it'll be done in full damn force. But I think for India, I think what is important, I think, is that it has suddenly forced it to look at this in an integrated way. That you can't anymore take it as a routine thing, and I think that's where this government, I think, has taken a set of decisions, and that brings me to the question that Malcolm asked. Look, I think if one thing our neighbors are telling us, look, there's something called non-alignment. Hello, you know, you've been talking about it for so long. Here is non-alignment for you. That actually, we can play the same game you played between the Russians and the Americans. So I think for India, I think which has preached the virtues of non-alignment, that it was all right to talk about this between distant powers. The Americans and Russians. Americans were twice removed, Russians were once removed, they were far away. So you could actually deal with these two powers in a different way. But I think for India, the problem today is that its neighbors, as I said, it goes back to 16 Nepal, where they first played the China card. Everybody has played it since then in different degrees. But today, I think the scale of influence that the Chinese can bring to the table has raised the quality of that, the intensity of that. And therefore, India has to devise a new strategy. That in the past, you could say, look, whatever the Chinese did, India would do the regime change. Sorry, I'm not being quoted on this, or I don't mean this literally. When it came to Kathmandu, that India would dominate the local political space. The Chinese are beginning to contest that too. So I think if the China's rise, it has a meaning to India's neighborhood, that you can't ignore it. You could not treat it the way you treated it before, and that if India says bow to you, KP Oli will go to say, look, each bow will cost you $2 billion. That today there is a room to play that card with significant benefits that opportunity did not exist before. Second, I think Chinese largely left to themselves non-interference, stay out of internal affairs, deal with whoever is in power. Today, I think they're beginning to show their hand a little bit. Certainly in Nepal, maybe in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, that they're going to say, we have a say too. So what does this mean? That look, for India, which had a free run generally outside Pakistan, in rest of South Asia, to the extent that it had a freer room, that room is being constricted by Chinese power. So it has to deal with it. And I think finally what they're saying is, to Sri Lankans, for example, look, we can give you good money, we'll make good promises when we'll deliver it. So which is previously, somebody sent a missive from Colombo saying, look, the embassy has sent a message saying, look, Hambantota port is open, can you do something about it? They never replied, I believe. But today, our foreign secretary has gone there 4 times, or prime minister has gone there twice. No, we're going to see what we can do, because we have to compete to retain our influence. I think that is the change, and I think this change is actually a fundamentally different outcome in South Asia, because the Chinese power today is very consequential, and dealing with it requires not the casual, lackadaisical approach that India has taken in the past, that it has to be on its toes. It has to have a serious economic policy, not just saying we love our neighbors. We need a military policy. Now, for example, Pakistan and China, as I said, is ready to give a fighter aircraft to the Sri Lankans. India is saying, please don't take it from them, just holding them, no. I'll give you something, but right now our plane is not ready. Just give me 2 years, I'll give you a plane. But the fact is, all this is there, in a public domain, that it has to fight for the space within the region, and that is a change. And I think this is in turn rooted in the fact, again I said, we underestimated the meaning of China's rise. That it is all about global power play, but it has a power play in your own neighborhood. And once you discover that, then we are scrambling now, I think, to cope with it. There's somebody at the back.
Yeah.
Yeah, you.
Thanks for a wonderful lecture. My name is Tyagesh, I'm a corporate advisor. And I'll take on the last point you made.
Yeah, about the various ministries that willy-nilly seem to be having stakes in most of these decisions that seem to be taken now. I can easily speculate how the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Infrastructure, the Ministry of External Affairs, call them Foreign Affairs perhaps, the Ministry of Defense, and probably something to do with Home Affairs too, can all get involved and claim stake to whatever is happening on this initiative by China itself. In that light, even without getting into what we did in history or what we didn't do in history, do you think the government today has a coherent, congruent policy, given the compulsions for each of these ministries can be different, to go out and handle such issues? Or are we still winging it and hoping that interpretations will happen that are kind enough?
Okay, I think that's probably going to be the last question that we can take for the day. So, Raja?
I think the 2 gentlemen here who served the government of India for almost 40 years each, and that's 8 years of government of India service. So they might be able to tell you better whether they can. Look, I think that question, I think it can only be proven in retrospect. Right? that whether I can say, look, India is getting its act together. That's a present continuous. What will prove that is, if India gets a deal on Trincomalee, it tells you finally the government of India is acting together to do a project in the neighborhood. Rest of it is talk. So the question is, what we've seen in the last 2 years is a government of India that's more sustained effort to compete for infrastructure projects in the neighborhood. Like if you see the 2 visits, I mean, I would say just take a look at what happened, Ranil Wickremesinghe's visit and Sheikh Hasina's visit to India. When you look at the joint statement, the amount devoted to infrastructure projects, that there is a new emphasis, and the PM, the previous PM, would not go to Sri Lanka on a multilateral conference called the Commonwealth Conference, saying Tamil Nadu, his party will get upset in Tamil Nadu, right? No, this PM has gone there twice in 2 years. So there is political will, there is no doubt about it. But you still have to translate that into specific outcomes. I believe some projects have moved with Bangladesh. Some projects are moving present continuous with Sri Lanka. So just wait and see. I mean, I think you don't need my arguments. If in the next 3 months you see some major announcements on India's projects in the neighborhood, that will tell you that the government of India is finally moving to get some things done.
Professor, if I could take this, my question is slightly different. Yes, excellent.
No, you asked whether the government is all there.
Let's take Amitendu, for instance. Do you think Mr. Gadkari's piece of the ministry, given its Sagarmala initiative, would be seeing Amitendu the same way that the Ministry of Defense does? And in which case, might well be the case, but presuming there is incongruence there. Do you think there is a single coherent overriding strategy that dictates how we progress, or are we just winging it?
No, that's what I'm telling you, that if I tell you they're not winging it, and if I tell you there is only one tiger on the mountain in Delhi now, and that unlike the previous government, each ministry was on its own, and there's one tiger on the mountain, he seems to wants to do things, that I can give you that analysis. That's of no use. It won't still prove the fact. Wait to see some projects materializing. And I believe this government is pushing vigorously, because the PM, he's put his personal prestige, maybe not as much as Xi Jinping, but he has some. So he's pushing for outcomes. And you'll see the proof of the pudding is finally if those outcomes actually materialize.
Raja, thank you so much. I think it was engrossing and very, very enlightening. Let me conclude with a kind of a formal thanks to Professor Mohan, but also by mentioning one point. In a sense, ISAS has become deeply, deeply connected to the Belt and Road Initiative, because one of the very, very few Indian representatives in this forum is actually a faculty from ISAS, who is obviously not here today because he's attending that conference, but I'm sure his insights will be at a premium once he comes back. That's our colleague, Mr. Surya Narayan. So Raja, on behalf of ISAS, this is a book with which you are also intellectually involved in the beginning, a book edited by Sindar, who is not our colleague anymore. He's with RSI's Constructing Indian Foreign Policy. Thank you so much for this lovely lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.